Hi everyone, Thomas Logan here, coming to you from Tokyo, Japan, and excited to be welcoming you back to Inclusive Design 24, 2021. We're about 7 to 8 hours into our event here of our 24-hour event, so really happy to have you for this hour with us. We want to thank you, our sponsors, and our supporters. So our platinum supporters are Intopia, Fable, Arc, and Adobe. And our gold supporter is Tetralogical. You can follow us on Twitter at ID24Conf, C-O-N-F. And if you have questions for our presenter today, please tweet them using the hashtag ID24 on Twitter. We will be able to look at those questions and include them in the Q&A at the end of the session. And now I'm happy to hand it over to Rachel, our guest host.
Hello, it's really nice to be here. I'm not anywhere as exciting as Japan. I'm in a shed in Bristol, so that's where I'm sat today. And so welcome to all of you who are all over the world watching this at whatever time it might be for you. I'm really happy to introduce Henny Swan, who is going to be talking about inclusive design principles, which were launched at ID24 in 2017. And since then, they've been helping teams put inclusion at the heart of their design process. Henny's a director at Tetralogical and a user experience and digital accessibility specialist with almost 20 years of experience. She's been at the BBC, the Paciello Group, Opera Software and RNIB. So Henny's in her element working with multidisciplinary teams to help infuse inclusion in each step in the software development lifecycle. So that might be by working on a product from its conception all the way through to completion, factoring user research with disabled users, early concept, documentation, design reviews, as well as agile usability testing as the product goes to development. So a warm welcome to Henny Swan and Inclusive Design Principles.
Thank you, Rachel. Gosh, that's quite a lofty bio. I normally just go by accessibility hobo, so maybe we'll try that next time. Welcome everybody who's joining for the first time and who has been with us for a while. It's a pleasure to be back talking at ID24 and sharing the inclusive design principles with you again. As Rachel mentioned, they were launched in 2017 and we weren't really sure how they were going to be used at that point, or you know, we had an intention of how they would be used and who would use them, but it's been interesting to see how people have adopted them over the last few years. So I wanted to talk a little bit about their history, because I think that's important to understanding them, and look at them through the lens of different disciplines and different activities that you might be doing within your product teams when designing and delivering accessible products. So just before I really get started, inclusive design is about everyone, no matter what your culture, your race, your ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, age, socioeconomic statuses or disability. But for the purposes of today, we are talking about disability. But I think it's a really useful thing to kind of keep thinking about how this applies for different types of users and groups of people who will be using your websites and your services. So the inclusive design principles are just that. They are a set of principles to help guide you when designing user experiences, features, and user journeys, which are inclusive for as broad an audience as possible, including people with disabilities. People often ask, well, how do these sit beside WCAG or with WCAG? Are they instead of WCAG? Absolutely not. They are intended to work alongside WCAG, which handles core accessibility of products and services that we are designing. WCAG, I feel, is the foundation upon which we build everything. Perhaps the principles are the way in which we colour it in and the way that we innovate on top of that accessible foundation. So if we think of WCAG Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, they're more prescriptive, they're testable, whereas the inclusive design principles don't define a specific outcome. They define a starting point. It helps you ask the questions, which then take you on that journey of deciding how to best design an inclusive experience. So WCAG is focused on specifics like color contrast or focus states or semantic structure, just to pick a few that relate back to design. Whereas the inclusive design principles are more about how you pull all of that together to make an inclusive experience. So it's more of a macro view, more of an umbrella approach to inclusion. They were written by 4 of us. So Ian Pouncey, who had done a lot of work in the early days at Yahoo, making things accessible, and later on at BBC, working on the framework, which is the header and the footer, as well as the iPlayer experience. Hayden Pickering, who has written extensively on inclusive design, including his Inclusive Components website, inclusive-components.design, and his book, Inclusive Design Patterns, which are really well worth a read. And then Leonie Watson, who has, amongst other things, done a lot of work in the early days at the Government Digital Service in the redesign and relaunch there, ensuring that it was inclusive and as accessible as possible. So in terms of who the principles are for, well, they're about people. They're about putting people first. And in fact, we did have that as one of our principles originally, but we realized that it was something that ran through each and every single principle. So we have that more as an underlying ethos and a reminder to put people at the center of the design process. I think often we can get very sidetracked within accessibility with thinking about compliance, meeting our legal requirements, standards and guidelines, and become a little bit more focused on code than we are on people and the design process. And I would say to you that, you know, it's very unlikely that your disabled audience are saying things like, oh yeah, hey, I want WCAG AA and I want some way ARIA and I want standards compliant code, etc. People are much more likely to say, well, I want a choice with how I interact with the web page or the application. I want to be in control of it. I don't want you telling me how to access or how to look at or what layout that I have to use for this complex content. And it's about adding value. So providing alternatives, but not an alternative experience. So providing alternatives that make the experience more comparable. So who can use them? Well, everybody can. I'd recommend that you go and read through them in the context of your own role and your own work and think about how it resonates with how the principles resonate with you. But they're really, in particular, very useful within teams for your business analysts, your product owners, when trying to visualize requirements, etc., your user researchers, user experience designers, visual designers, interaction designers, content designers, and your developers. So they're really there for everybody to use, not just on the design end. So we have 12 principles, 7 principles. I don't know where 12 came from. Provide a comparable experience, consider situation, be consistent, give control, prioritize content, and add value. Now, I mentioned that the principles came about as a result of working on early designs at BBC, and specifically for iPlayer, which relaunched with responsive iPlayer and on iOS and on Android simultaneously. In particular, we were looking at the media player, and at that time there were 40 media players that were used by BBC. So with 40 media players, you have a very fractured and disjointed experience regardless of who you are. And also it's a nightmare to handle in terms of consistently making things accessible. So we were going down a route of consolidating everything and creating one HTML player. Now we knew it needed to be accessible, and we understood how to do that. We had the web content accessibility guidelines, and we were using those internally. We were figuring out everything that needed to be done, text descriptions, keyboard support. But we also understood that an inclusive player is so much more than just an accessible player. You know, what do people want in terms of the tools within the player? How do they discover the right content that they need? For example, how do you quickly get people to signed content within the player or audio described content? You then have scenarios of people who want to persistently have captions switched on, but you might have people who want captions subtitled sometimes, but not all the time. So there's all these different situations and types of cases that people use the player in. We also knew that we had an abundance of ideas and features that we wanted to add to the player. So one of the ways that we started to prioritize what we might put in would be around, well, what is the positive impact this might have on our disabled users? So in early designs, we started to kind of shape our ideas around give choice, offer choice, give users control, be consistent, and add value, which influenced, for example, implementing Chromecast into the player. But looking at each of the principles through the lens of different tasks and roles, I want to kind of take a few examples that illustrate how they could be used by you in your job. Requirements. Every project is based on requirements, which in turn drive the design brief, which in turn drive the design and the development and ultimately the product. Requirements marry very well with our first principle, which is consider situation. People use your interface in different situations. Make sure your interface delivers a valuable experience to people regardless of their circumstances. I kind of think of this principle, consider situation, as really got sort of the content that we're all using is secondary. It's actually about people. It's the who. We have all sorts of people who are using our products. And they're not just defined by their disability. In fact, that is not the main definition of each of our different types of people that we should be considering. We need to be considering people in terms of why they're using our products and where they are and what might be the pressures or what might be the circumstances of their use. So you might have a lady who perhaps has broken her wrist on her dominant arm, and literally overnight, she's forced to use a keyboard, which she might not be familiar with. So all of a sudden she has an access need and very little knowledge about that access need and how to interact with content. Perhaps your product is not focused on children, but is perhaps used by young adults who might be studying or doing research for a project. And perhaps those young adults are blind and they use a screen reader and braille displays. Or maybe you have people who are more visual and prefer pictures over text to help understand information, like this young artist with Down syndrome who might be looking up information about art for reference, but prefers more imagery. Or perhaps you have a website or app that's being used on a watch or a mobile device predominantly outside, like listening to music or tracking your times when you're exercising, like this woman who is racing in her wheelchair outside in the early morning. If you consider this, the context of each of these different individuals and how they're using it, that helps you understand how we can perhaps start tweaking our user experiences. For example, perhaps the app that this lady in a wheelchair is using, maybe she normally wears reading glasses, and because she's out racing in her wheelchair, she hasn't got them on because otherwise she can't see where she's going. The Babylon Health design system, Babylon Health DNA, captures how to consider situation for your disabled people, disabled audience beautifully. They write, before writing any piece of content, ask yourself 3 questions. How does my audience or user feel right now? How does my audience, what does my audience, the user, need to know? And what is the designed outcome? I think if you insert disabled audience user, you have a pretty good method for considering multiple different situations. Rise is a domestic abuse charity here in Brighton, where I live, and does something that many websites, which are similar, do for people who are visiting. So, it is fair to say that many people who are using the site might be under a lot of time pressure. They might be incredibly stressed or anxious, and perhaps in fear of someone looking over their shoulder and seeing what they're browsing. So they have a very predominant quick close button at the top of the website that takes you off to the Google homepage. It sits along the top, the width of the website. It's clearly labeled quick close visually. It has an X, so you understand that you can close it. It's really there, prioritized in the content at the top, which you can see visually, but also as somebody who might be a low vision user, it's the first thing you see. As somebody who uses a screen reader, it's the first thing you hear. David Swallow has written a couple of very great articles on a web of anxiety, accessibility for people with anxiety and panic disorders that are worth a read. The links to some of the resources I'm mentioning should be tweeted out on the ID account, and I will be also tweeting them out afterwards. I should have said that earlier. These are two great articles that you should absolutely go and read, because honestly, I don't think we think about anxiety and mental health when it comes to design really enough. And it's important because it's fair to say many people will experience difficulties with this at all times, but also ultimately, when you take these design considerations into account, you are generally helping with the usability of your website overall. The Home Office has a really neat downloadable poster on do's and don'ts, which is worth having a look at as well. So that takes me on to user research. A good user experience is a researched user experience. And typically what we are researching in user experience is choice. So offer choice. Consider providing different ways for people to complete tasks, especially those that are complex or non-standard. Choice is important because while we can make a feature or a component or a page accessible according to WCAG, it still might not be usable for some disabled people. And we might not always know that. It may not be particularly obvious. An example that really illustrated that to me was the use of subtitles within a media player, and specifically iPlayer Captions, as it's called in the US. So we had a situation where within the media player for iPlayer, we were introducing a plugin at the bottom of the player where you opened a more button and you had more content appear horizontally at the bottom of the player with, next episode or shows like it, etc. Now, as a subtitle user, if you opened that plugin, then it obscures the area of the screen where you would expect to see subtitles. So there was some debate internally, and some people said, well, why would you be looking at two pieces of content simultaneously? Surely if you're looking at the content in the plugin, you don't need to see the content of the subtitles. We didn't believe that to be so at all. So we decided that to do some user research and ask people two questions. If you had a choice, where would you position subtitles when the plugin is open? To the side, just above the plugin, to the top of the screen? And if you had a choice, what size would the subtitles be? We asked people who were deaf and hard of hearing, but we also knew that different situations necessitate the use of subtitles. So people browsing in a second language, people who are autistic, people in a noisy environment. So we included a whole range of different types of people that we tested. So typically subtitles appear at the bottom of the page, and our research, very unsurprisingly, told us that people wanted subtitles to persistently appear on the screen and never be obscured. And the majority preference was that they were pushed up to the top and not positioned in the bottom of the, just above the more content or the plugin content, because then they would be positioned in the middle of the screen, which is actually where typically you have people's faces and you will be able to lip read. So you don't want that being obscured. Next up, we have user experience and design. And again, it's, we know what we need to design, we've got our requirements, but how is the best way to do this? And how can we really add value? So add value is consider the value of features and how they improve the experience for different users. Often we design a pathway or a journey, but actually one of the things that I do a lot in my work is when I'm working with our clients, they'll come and we'll look at our designs, their designs. We will comment on the accessibility and how to do color contrast, etc. But actually that's not the main part of what we do. The main part of what we do is look at the pathways, the journeys, and ask ourselves, is this the best way? How can we make this easier for somebody to use? So a very common example that I find myself suggesting all the time is if you have a password login scenario with email and password, always include a show password button. so that people can check that they've got the right input before they proceed to the submit button. Text input is hard. It's difficult for people with dexterity issues. It's difficult on a touch screen if you've got cold hands or you're out in the rain. It's easy to make a mistake. It's difficult with recall with passwords, which are secure as well. So we want to add value and make things as easy as possible. Biometrics is another very important way of adding value, not least upon mobile devices. Our devices are, because of the features and functionality they have in them, they are literally an extension of the capabilities of your websites and applications. And they're equally an extension of the capabilities of us as human beings as well. So features such as iris scanning, voice, facial recognition, fingerprint authentication, which are all available in modern phones, are an excellent way of adding value and helping people bypass tricky form input that we know is problematic for a number of different reasons. There's a blog post by a gentleman who talks about new voice assistant on his My Per Mobile app, which I have to confess I haven't tested, but he is a wheelchair user and has his mobile phone attached to the front of the wheelchair. When he is at home, he can use his pointing device attached to his head, and he can use the phone that way, but that's not particularly convenient when he's out and about. So being able to use his voice to use his phone is essential. Equally, he says this app allows me to be more independent and frees up my parents' time so they don't have to check things for me. But remember, with biometrics, by their very nature, as much as they can make things more inclusive, they are also exclusionary. I can't use touch verification, authentication if I'm paralyzed or holding a bag of shopping. I can't use voice if I'm non-verbal or deaf or have a sore throat. I can't use facial recognition if I'm unable to move my phone to my face or if I'm driving. So you must always design these additional value add experiences together with another accessible input method, which would typically most likely be a form input. It brings us to our next principle. So within the context of visual design, the principle of give control. Ensure people are in control. People should be able to access and interact with content in their preferred way. Giving control is as much about giving control as it is about not taking control away. As designers, we take control away in so many different ways, either consciously or unconsciously. We do have the power to enable and disable people with our design choices, and we can enable disabled people and we can disable enabled people. We have to be very careful. So yes, push the boundaries of innovation and design and do the next best thing. Otherwise, we don't advance modern web design. But don't make decisions for people about how they want to control content. Always leave control with people. So a common example would be auto-playing content on page load. So on Netflix, a typical experience is that when you mouse over content, it starts to play a clip from the show and it has audio. They very rightly put in a mute button so you can mute the sound, which is good. It's good for people who easily get distracted by sound. It's good for someone who is using a screen reader who might not be able to hear their screen reader because of the sound. But actually, perhaps going a step further and having a button to stop the movement would be even better for people who are sensitive to movement and have not been warned that it's coming, and because that would actually prevent them accessing the full page fully. Control would also be sort of allowing people, giving people the control over how layout is presented. If you think of an interface where you're sharing files, so on Dropbox, an interface where you have hundreds and hundreds of files, like I have hundreds of images, you want to be able to control the layout. I've seen in usability testing a lady who was autistic, who very, very much did not like scrolling and found herself not able to scroll comfortably. So for her, she wanted a list on the page because that put as much information on the page as possible. However, other people might prefer a large grid with images on the page because they're able to understand those images better. So you're including lots of different approaches and needs there. Mega menus and flyout menus are also hard for people. Yes, you can make them technically accessible, but it doesn't mean that they're still usable for some people. James Williamson, who has ALS, has written incredible blog posts on his condition. ALS is also known as locked-in syndrome. You might remember the ice bucket challenge, but your muscles deteriorate, your voice deteriorates. So his situation is that he would sort of use a bit of mouse, a bit of voice, a bit of keyboard, and it would depend and vary on the task. But he talks about mega menus, and he says, when creating drop-down menus or complex menu interactions, carefully consider the amount of distance you're asking the user to travel and the hit target required by the menu. Allowing any drop-down content to remain visible until focus has been moved away from the menu creates a much more accessible navigation pattern. He created this video of navigation, horizontal navigation. When you mouse over a link, you have sub-navigation appear horizontally, but it's in a very narrow bar. So it's actually really quite difficult for him to get focus onto the links within it. And that's something that I would struggle with, and I don't consider myself to have any dexterity issues. So that brings us to interaction design and be consistent. Use familiar conventions and apply them consistently. Give people what they know and what they know how to use, be it your pattern library or standard design patterns. We talk about two types of consistency: internal consistency and external consistency. So thinking back to our lady with the broken arm, who is unfamiliar with using a keyboard to navigate the web, I would imagine that, she'll wake up and go, hey, I need to get back to work. I need to start being productive again. I need to figure out how to use a keyboard. So the first thing she's going to do is to look for how to navigate web pages using a keyboard. She's then going to find information around standard navigation using a keyboard. So tab, return, etc. That information is also going to include standard navigation for complex components like autocomplete, dialogues, tab panels, which she'll start to use. But if your components have been designed and they are not using standard navigation, she is then in a situation where she's thinking, I'm doing it wrong, it's my fault, and her productivity is undermined. For internal consistency, think about your internal design patterns, your design systems, your iconography, but also your editorial for text descriptions that screen reader users will be using. So again, thinking about our young adult here who is a screen reader user and uses a Braille display, perhaps they're in a situation where they're using an online learning platform. And if that platform has multiple different players, there might be some inconsistency. We did a labeling audit at BBC of various different parts of the website, including players, and we found that we had multiple different icons visually for full screen, amongst many other icons, and they all had a different screen reader output as well. So it was inconsistent and confusing. Next, we have content design, and I think this one really sort of pairs well with prioritizing content. So help users focus on core tasks, features, and information by prioritizing them within your content and layout. Visual structure is really important for making sense of information on a page. This can be done through a number of different means, so element size, color, shape, behaviors, hover states to identify links, layout. For example, we expect to see search at the top of the page. Good visual structure helps people identify, more quickly sort of what's important, what the priority content is, and how they can move through the site quickly and accurately without kind of having to go back and forth. This really helps people with on the autism spectrum and other conditions, cognitive conditions, who might have issues around executive functioning. So executive functioning deals with getting things into the right order, processing information and planning where to go next, understanding what you need to do next. In other words, issues with prioritizing content. The mental health charity Mind does a masterclass in prioritizing content. On their homepage, which is really clear and really simple, they have the Mind logo, top left in the header. They then have 2 call to actions: get help now and make a donation. And that is the sum total of what that site does. It is to ultimately give people help and to get people to help them. It then has a simple navigation, which is just links, no flyouts, nothing like that. It also has a search, which is persistently available and there within the header. No need to set focus in it and have it expand, which is confusing. It also has a coronavirus alert, which most websites have at the moment, and then a very simple layout. So a heading, some text, get involved, and another big call to action to how can we support you. All of this comes with crisp contrast as well. So visually, it does an amazing job at prioritizing content, but we're not all visual. How can we make that clear for somebody who is a screen reader user? How can we ensure that they get the key messages of get help now and make a donation? I mentioned earlier that Leonie worked on the gov.uk website. That does a really good job for screen reader users when it comes to finding information. Government websites are hard, where there's so much information they have to present to you, and we need that information in order to do what we need to do in our daily lives as citizens. They do a grand job, because what they do is they really focus on a heading structure and a good layout for regions, lists, and placing common features in the header, etc. Now, not only do they do that well, they think about those things and how they fit together, not just within a page, but also within a user journey. So here I have a page which is claim a tax refund. So again, we've got the gov.uk logo at the top. We have a search, which is persistently there and available, no hidden search button, coronavirus alert, a breadcrumb, home, money and tax, income tax, followed by a heading, some text, a list, and a start now button. And then there's some related links as well. So the heading structure is simple: H1, claim a tax refund; H2, related content. There is then regions applied to the page, and what you'll see is the main region is positioned so it starts just before the H1, so it all sits well together. So as a screen reader user, I know that if I go to the start of the main region, I will find my H1. It then has lists around the breadcrumb and the list embedded in the page and the related content. So what we're seeing now is that every single part of the page is somehow discoverable semantically, so via regions, headings, lists, etc. We also have the breadcrumb trail, which is really essential for so many different users for finding stuff. I know Jamie Knight has talked about, and he's autistic, has talked about how valuable a breadcrumb trail is for him. Where have I come from? And it just reinforces where you've come from. The other thing that they do really well is they have any link embedded in a page has the same editorial as the page it links to. So here we have a page with claim a tax refund. You go to the tax refund page and the page title is claim a tax refund. The URL, claim a tax refund, and you've guessed it, the heading is claim a tax refund. This helps reinforce that you are at the right place and that you found the content that you were trying to prioritize. So how does this translate for someone who uses screen magnification? Screen magnification users typically hit challenges where you have pages which are incredibly busy and cluttered. So oftentimes that really comes through on websites where there's a lot of heavy advertising, which you might find at the top of the page or at the side of the page. Here we have a TV website where I have zoomed in, and you can literally just see the top of the page with a little bit of an advert and the navigation. And as I navigate around the page to go and select a program to watch, I move down the page, I find a carousel. In the carousel, I choose a program, Breaking the Law, Bank Coppers. So I'm going to watch that. The page opens, I see the heading. Good, I'm at the right page. I see what looks like an outline of where the media player could load, and I just see the media player loading when another video pops down from the top of the page, and in that video is a dinosaur skeleton with Abraham Lincoln sticking out of his nose. So I know that's not the video that I went to go and watch, but it has completely thrown me because I can't now find my priority content. So I have to start scrolling around the page and move down to see where it is, which I eventually find. Editorial. This really translates well to comparable experience. Ensure your interface provides a comparable experience for all, so people can accomplish tasks in a way that suits their needs without undermining the quality of the content. We ummed and ahed about comparable or equivalent experience. And actually, it was Loni who said, sometimes you can't create an equivalent experience. And she gave the example of watching a movie. For her, she has audio description switched on, but audio description is never going to be the equivalent of watching it visually. However, if the quality of the audio description is good, then it gives her as comparable an experience as it can do. A good example of comparable experience is also those images that sit somewhere between decorative and editorial. So a decorative image doesn't bring any additional meaning to a page. An editorial image brings meaning to the page that isn't otherwise conveyed elsewhere. But sometimes we have images that can be described as emotion-rich images, and Loni has written about this as well, where it gives a sense or injects a bit of personality into the page, which is nice to convey to people. And actually, we did that with the Inclusive Design Principles homepage, where we decided, because it was otherwise a wall of text, to put in 3 hot air balloons with a cloud and the sun behind. This is what we would describe as an emotion-rich image, because we put it there to give a visual sense of thoughtfulness and inspiration. Why wouldn't we convey that to our blind users as well? So the text description is 3 hot air balloons hang together in a calm, sunny sky. And I say text description and not text alternative, because again, text descriptions are primary content. We shouldn't think about them as being alternative. They're the primary means for many people to access content. And as Loni herself said, I used to have sight, so I appreciate decorative text on some emotion-rich images, some being the operative word. We don't want to go over the top, but again, you need to be thinking about what people might want. So that's fine for the odd image here and there, but probably the conversations we have the most are around data visualization and how do we make complex data a comparable experience for people who can't see it. I think the ultimate data visualization is quite literally under our nose. We use it every day, often when we're leaving the house on our phone, and that is a map. A map is very complex. It's when you look at it, it conveys many different things: locations of pubs, restaurants, shops, how to get from A to B, whether you can do that using a bus or walking, etc. Conveying all that information could be really, really complex, but maps have done it well because they understand that as a user, you are looking probably for one piece of information at a time, although what you're looking at from moment to moment might change. So maps just include a panel with text alternatives to the map. So you can choose your mode of transport for going from A to B. You can put in your address. Those modes of transport then give you options. So if I'm selecting public transport, I get 2 or 3 different routes. Those routes are visible on the map, I can see that, but they're also written in text below, and I can filter those options. I can put times to those options. So actually, that map, which we might have thought of as being the primary way of conveying information, to my mind becomes the secondary way of conveying information, which is all conveyed in an accessible and usable way that gives users choice over what information they see when, so you don't get information overload. So that's the whistle-stop tour through the principles. Thank you for listening. The slides will be up on presentations.tetralogical.com later today. I will tweet those out via my account on Twitter at iheni, IHENI. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Henny. That was awesome overview and lots of awesome resources. I have a little cred that I've actually been to the Sasquatch Music Festival, so I like to see that mention in there. That was a great festival.
Oh,
so
good.
I'm gonna, yeah, it's very cool. So I'm gonna hand it over to Rachel. Rachel, do we have any questions for Henny?
I'm not able to start my video because it's been stopped by the host, I think. But can you hear me? perhaps
yes,
that will.
Can hear you.
We can hear you.
Right, here we go. There we go. Right, I'm just sort of getting a message. So yeah. I had a question actually. I was interested by your sort of persona of the person who'd broken a wrist and suddenly found herself having to keyboard navigate, because that happened to me in 2013 when I shattered my elbow. And suddenly I went from being a very able-bodied person to losing the use completely of my right hand for quite a long time, and even now it's not great and it's very variable. But I kind of just sort of listening to you talking, I was thinking about the balance of these different needs that people have. You know, the needs of a screen reader user is very different to my need, where sometimes I can't really use my right hand very well, and it's like typing with a potato. You know, and I think people listening to this might be thinking, oh, you know, how am I going to balance all of these different needs of people? You know, how can I make sure this is working for the screen reader user, but also for someone who is having to use the keyboard, and also for someone who is very visual? You know, what was your advice for people to how to sort of navigate that and feel like they're not completely overwhelmed?
Yeah, I know that's a really good question. Sorry to hear about your elbow, by the way, that's rubbish. But that's it. That's a really good question. And I think it can be incredibly overwhelming. And I think really what we need to do is kind of unpick some of the mythology around this, because for our convenience, as designers and developers and within accessibility, we categorize people as blind screen reader users or keyboard users or people with cognitive challenges, etc. So we come up with these quite kind of stringent stereotypes, where actually we're not really like that at all. We're a mixture of all sorts of different things. And really, there's so much crossover between these different types of groups. And you said it yourself. So, you know, you had to use a keyboard. A screen reader user has to use a keyboard. So actually, the needs of a screen reader user and a keyboard user are very, very similar in some regard. You know, everybody needs to be able to access components and content using standard keyboard navigation. That also translates well over to people who use voice input as well. Some of their needs are very similar as well. So I think what perhaps would help people is to start thinking about individuals as opposed to types of disability. And to do that, you can look within your community, you can do research, you can invite people and start learning about how individuals might have a variety of different needs. But I would say that it's very rare that you come up against a piece of design which works for one and doesn't for another. It happens very occasionally, and sometimes you have to make choices or provide alternatives. But I would say that there is a huge amount of crossover between different types of people, and it's and it's not, once you start digging, it's not as contrary to each as you'd think.
Yeah, that's really good. I think part of it is it just feels a bit, I think for a lot of people it just feels a bit overwhelming, doesn't it?
Yeah.
That not sort of knowing what, where to start really.
Yeah, no, absolutely. But I think, again, this is where the principles should help, because if we think about the example of prioritizing content and the example I gave of Mind and how visually it was presented, structurally, if it's coded correctly, that is a brilliant experience for somebody who can't see the screen as well.
Yeah.
So oftentimes you might be focusing on one particular need, but actually you are addressing the needs of other people that you might not be focusing on in that moment.
Yeah. So I've got a question here, actually from Thomas. So I hope I'm going to share this correctly. Saying that he loved the example from gov.uk, getting the harmony of links, titles, URLs, the headings sort of displayed on the page. So how do you go about getting something like that implemented organization wide? How do you get sort of buy-in, I guess, for that?
It will depend on your organization. That doesn't help you as an answer. You can package and sell it in a number of different ways. So SEO, that's going to help you, right? It also just helps development-wise and understanding and organizing your site. I think it's something you need to be thinking about really, really early on. So when you're thinking about the architecture of your site, coming up with good editorial and reinforcing that good practice earlier. But I would say it would make the site so much easier to maintain. It means that you can get that embedded into your editorial guidelines. So it helps, editors don't really need to think too much about how they write their link text, because, oh, hey, this goes to the claim a tax refund page. So I don't need to think, well, what should I do the link text? What should I have as link text? It's kind of written for you. So, it helps with SEO, it helps with maintenance, it helps people get their jobs done quicker and easier, which I think is probably something that's a good enough sell. And then ultimately it helps your users and it helps people complete transactions and do things quicker. So
yeah, I think that's a really good, but I think getting buy-in from different groups, if you can sort of say, hey, this will make your job easier as well. I mean, that even if those people aren't really putting the inclusivity at front and center, actually there's just a reason to do that. As an editor, I like style guides, because it reduces that cognitive overhead. It's something else I don't have to think about. It's like, oh right, that's what we do here.
Absolutely. And I think if we're talking about buy-in, I think we have to acknowledge that there's somebody who works sort of within this field, and actually as a designer, as an accessibility person, there is a degree of diplomacy, and you need to speak to people within their kind of sort of role and field of understanding. And I think there's many different hooks that work for different types of role when it comes to communicating the benefits of accessibility, which go way beyond including people with disabilities, fortunately, which is good.
Yeah. So I mean, if anyone watching this this is pretty new to them, what are the kind of, what would be your sort of real takeaway? Where should you start if this is pretty new in something you're trying to learn about, you're keen, or you're watching this, you're keen to know more about, and you're keen to start implementing in your organization? What would be the first things you think people should just head out and start doing?
So the challenge is knowing which resources are appropriate ones. I think a good place to start would be on the Web Accessibility Initiative website. They have some really incredible introductory resources. There's something called WAY Perspectives, the Web Accessibility Initiative Perspectives, where they introduce different types of people and how they interact with content, and they talk about specific challenges that those people have. And actually, to speak to your question, Rachel, as well, that about kind of, it's quite overwhelming. They do have videos where they talk about the diversity within diversity of individuals and how that impacts content. So that's a really good place to start. I would also say start there, because then you get an understanding of how we should be talking about and communicating about accessibility. And that will set you up to give you a bit of judgment about some of the resources that you might then find yourself to go on to. There is also a free course that the Web Accessibility Initiative have created on Introduction to Accessibility Fundamentals, which is contributed to by various different people throughout the industry, including myself. So you get to listen to me again, which is really useful. WebAIM, also great. They have been around forever. They are trusted. They're a great bunch. Jared Smith is speaking. I think he's in the last slot today. So yes, I would start there. And then start building out as and when you feel a little bit more confident to build out to other resources.
That's great. Well, I guess we should wrap up soon and get ready for the next speaker. So it's been really great speaking to you and then hearing your talk today, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Enjoy your day.
Yeah, so thank you, Henny and Rachel, both for this event. Reminder for everyone, if you like this session, which I'm sure you did, because so much awesome information, you should hit the YouTube like button and subscribe to youtube.com/inclusivedesign24. And that will keep you in the loop for our future events, as well as keep you up to date on the events coming up later today. Share it with your friends, tell everyone. A reminder that our #ID24 community is a respectful community, and you can find our code of conduct on the Inclusive Design 24 website. Our event today is brought to you with thanks to our supporters, Intopia, Fable, TPGI Arc, Adobe, Tetralogical, Intuit, InfoAxia, Center for Inclusive Design, Web Directions AAA, Adrian Roselli LLC, and Can I Access? So Inclusive Design 24 is going to be right back at the top of the hour with our next session. We'll see you soon. Thank you, everyone.